Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and this is a show where we talk about things to do with media and communication with people who live and work in Boston. And today we're talking to Jonathan King from MIT, a biochemist, who is here because we're going to talk about media and communication in the field in which he's been particularly interested in, which is the field that he really cares about, perhaps, apart from his career path, and that is the peace movement, and in particular a connection to Mass Peace Action, an organisation that's been active in Boston for a long time, and the way that this organisation connects with Jonathan's interests and perhaps skills in communication and the challenges in communication. So welcome, Jonathan.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's good to see you. So I wanted to draw attention to the kind of question of what we talk of these days or speak about as intersectionality. The way that a movement connects with a lot of different interests. In this case, the intersection is between your work as a knowledge expert, maybe not necessarily clearly related to peace activism, but certainly a knowledge expert, and its intersection then your skills around knowledge with peace and peace activism, the anti-nuclear movement, and the challenges around communication, and how that all sort of comes together in your life and how it's been part of the fabric of life in Boston. So perhaps we could start with some of the questions about how you got there and how those intersections emerged.
Good questions. Well, as you can tell, I'm of the age when I was in college and graduate school and an initial researcher, which was during the period of the resistance to the Vietnam War. I would say almost every major campus in the United States had groups of students and faculty who were actively opposed to the war. I was a graduate student at Caltech. Caltech was the home of Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and then he led the effort, while he was at Caltech, he led the effort to ban atmospheric testing. The first atmospheric test ban. You may remember there was concern about fallout, strontium-90 getting into cow's milk and mother's milk, and there was quite a movement in the United States. So at the time when I was becoming a scientist, these issues of, for example, nuclear disarmament were not considered divergent from being a scientist. And in fact, in my particular area, molecular biology and structural biology, the structure of proteins and viruses, that had been led by British scientists from the British Medical Research Council. They were all active in World War II against fascism, and they were very strong spokespeople for the fact that the scientific community was an international community, and in the struggle for knowledge, struggle for truth, you could not ignore forces like the Nazis. So when I was a young scientist, it was considered natural. Now that has changed greatly over the period, which I'll talk about. And now at this time, the number of campuses in the United States where you have an active group that's actively advocating for peace or opposing nuclear weapons, you can count them on the fingers of two hands. All of the historic centers of resistance to the war, University of California, Berkeley, University of Wisconsin-Madison, no longer have major groups in this direction. One of the consequences is a young person can go through college and not even know what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Incredible.
Not know that the U.S. has 7,000 nuclear weapons, and that almost 2,000 of them are on hair trigger alert. Not know that more than half the taxes they spend go to the Pentagon. So we now face a situation where there's still this danger. The world is still awash with nuclear weapons, and yet the general public, and in fact even the academic public, this is kind of very low on their their agenda. Now, in the last couple, since the accession of Trump and North Korean threat, and then him saying, my button is bigger than your button, and what's the point of having nuclear weapons if you can't use them? There's been a kind of increase in awareness, but it's not that sharp. I'm very active in my neighborhood associations around housing and transit. No, this is not something people are talking about. It's very hard to get it on the agenda. You have to work very hard to say, what does that have to do with what we're dealing with? But peace action, which started in 60 years ago, is one of the organizational forms that stayed active through this period of ebb and flow. And so now we are in a position to try to reach out with a base of thousands of members in this area. Newton's very important, actually, many members in Newton, and try to bring these issues back to the public consciousness, because absent that, we don't have too much hope for long-term peace.
Well, long-term peace has been part of what's referred to as a social movement. The peace movement was a social movement, very important, as you noticed, in the Vietnam War, is stemming probably from campuses because of the conscription movement, or anti-conscription movement amongst young people. What do you see as the kind of foundation, if at all, for a social movement today around peace and activism on campuses?
Well, one thing is, I don't think we can go back. Many of our viewers will remember, or some will remember, the nuclear weapons freeze campaign in the 1980s. A million people gathered in Central Park, and that was responding directly to the danger, the threat of nuclear war. That's not going to work today, right? Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets to defend healthcare, right? To allow immigrants into the country, Social Security. Those are the issues that are on people's minds. And as someone who speaks to various groups on the threat of nuclear weapons, no, we're not going to get hundreds of thousands. We're not going to get a mass movement by focusing on a fear of the use of nuclear weapons. But the reality is, and it's very clear under Trump because he stated it, the only way to finance the enormous investment that's continuing in weapons, nuclear weapons, right? Government's proposing to spend $1 trillion, $1,000 billion over the next 30 years to upgrade and modernize all the components of the nuclear weapons triad, submarines, the old missiles in the silos, bombs on the bombers. The only way they can finance that is to take money from healthcare, from education, from environmental protection. And that's exactly what they're doing. And in fact, in Trump's original, his first budget, his budget director, Mick Mulvaney, he was asked by the National Governors Association, why are you cutting these very popular programs like the National Institute of Health Research, National Science Foundation, Environmental Protection? And Mulvaney said, well, we want to put $57 billion more into the Pentagon budget, and so we're going to cut the civilian budget. Now, unfortunately, those people who are marching to defend healthcare don't at the present time understand that the only way healthcare, medical care can get financed is by cutting the Pentagon budget. You can't, even deficit spending is becoming a problem because the deficit is so large that's limited. They've put in these tax cuts, so they're reducing revenue. So the reality is that if you want decent housing, forget housing, let's talk about public transit, right? The Green Line does get out here.
The Green Line still runs.
So I live in Central, part of Cambridge I live in, the thriving economy, absolutely dependent on the Red Line, Green Line, Orange Line, et cetera. Those are all built with federal funds, not by property taxes or fares, but that has disappeared. The only way you can really revitalize that, the only way the U.S. can have a really modern transit system is public, federal, congressional investment. Well, you can't do that if you're going to spend $1 trillion on weapons. So the communication problem is to communicate to someone, let's say, concerned about public transit. You want better transit, you want the roads fixed, you're going to have to oppose the nuclear weapons modernization. Forget about, it doesn't have anything to do with national security. It's a straight economic trade-off. And so, we're in the process of trying to do that, and we talk about, I've run a couple of conferences called Invest in Mines, Not Missiles, build subways, not submarines, housing, not bombs. But it's hard to break that silo where most people consider the Pentagon budget something else. Right. It's some other world. I think I know on my street, a lot of people don't realize that their taxes finance that. They think the Pentagon is some other source of income.
Well, we can look at the details of this from the Mass Peace Action newsletter, and it's an important and useful way of segueing also into the detail of this, and we can have a look at the precise numbers here. I think we can see it on the screen, but also we can see the importance of simple communication.
Right.
A newsletter that tells people and shows people, illustrates clearly what's going on.
Right.
And it makes the point, without me having to make too much of a statement about it, that if you don't have things to actually give people, material objects, it can often be a matter of just more hot air, more discussion. Right. So this really makes it concrete.
It's a key point. Most of your viewers have paid income taxes all their lives. None of them have ever received from the federal government or from the IRS or from the administrative branch a description of how their tax dollars were spent last year. I don't know about Newton, but in Cambridge we pay property taxes, and the city manager sends us twice a year a report on how those property taxes were spent, how much for
education,
schools, how much for fixing the streets, how much for police, how much fire. The federal government does not tell you how much money was spent on housing and education, healthcare, and in particular, they don't tell you that they're spending more than half your dollars on the Pentagon budget. I know, if my neighbors on Essex Street in Central Square knew that half of their income tax dollars were going to the Pentagon budget, their attitudes toward that budget would change, right? If you ask people how much you think we spend on the military, say, well, 10%, 15%, maybe 20%. You say, no, it's almost 60%, because I don't believe you. And then you have to say, no, they say, I've never seen an article like that. And in fact, when those funds are voted, they were just voted for 2019 a few weeks ago. Not the New York Times, not the Wall Street Journal, not the Boston Globe. No national media outlet reports the actual numbers. They'll talk about some little side debate about bathrooms in the South or some side amendment.
Sure.
They never report that pie chart with the actual numbers. And this is the influence of the defense industry, enormously influential in the United States, very sophisticated, and they know that if people knew how much money came to them, there'd be a different outcome of some of those votes.
Well, it's a pretty sad indictment of the state of journalism, isn't it, and the state of media?
Yeah, but it's been a problem for a while.
Yeah, and it's part of a long-standing critique of certainly mainstream journalism, which is ironic in the sense that, given where we're at now with the federal government, and certainly for the last maybe 7 or 8 years, the whole idea of the mainstream media being untrustworthy has become more prevalent. And now we have a president who tweets without any reference to the media, and has really changed the landscape quite a lot. I mean, is there a way of thinking about how the kind of social movement activism around peace and disarmament that you're involved in could be, or could use those kinds of models, different kinds of ways of thinking?
Well, first, programs like this, right, little points of light, very important. During the anti-war movement, very often the form it took was an alternative newspaper, right, which reported much more accurately what was going on than the campus newspapers. So these little pieces of truthful journalism, I think, are very, very important. I hope we can grow them. My assessment is that or my experience in trying to influence major corporate media, very limited, and the successes all took the form of having a candidate emerge in an electoral battle, like in a primary battle, who would raise issues that weren't raised by the incumbent. And because there was a real debate going on around those issues, it would get covered. But that's, most incumbents at the federal and state level run unopposed. There's no opponent whatsoever. So one of the things that even the Peace Action has been very involved in is trying to join with other groups like Our Revolution, Progressive Democrats of America, to try to bring forward candidates for public office who will talk about the fact that we're not going to be able to get housing if we spend, $600 billion on the Pentagon or $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. We'll see in this going into this 2018 election whether that's whether those issues will come to the fore. They may not, because even progressive candidates, Bernie Sanders, who is as progressive as you could get, right? Yeah. In the presidential campaign, he never mentioned, foreign military intervention on nuclear weapons. Subsequently, he's recognized that you can't ignore this. But in the presidential campaign, neither he nor Hillary, they were silent on that, and they were the Democratic candidates.
Yes. Well, we could say that that's a bit shameful, but I don't want to spend too much time bashing mainstream or otherwise Democratic Party candidates. Will get us off our topic, but we could probably talk about that for a while. But the fascinating intersection here, of course, is the way that we can both orchestrate and construct a media and communication policy around the things that matter by thinking strategically. So clearly your example of what Bernie Sanders could or couldn't say, or he actually gets in front of a television camera, what he can say can then readjust the possibility of consciousness and understanding, and also just simply knowledge, public knowledge.
Right. Yeah. A positive example, in the Congress. I mean, these budgets are voted by the Congress, right? They're and by particular committees of the Congress. There's a progressive caucus in the House. It's actually the biggest caucus, 80 or 90 members. And the progressive caucus each year puts out an alternative budget. It used to be called the Budget for All. Now it's called the People's Budget. It's coming out this week. When the Republicans bring in their budget, it's 2,000 pages. There's no debate on the, on any of the details, right? It's just, it either goes through or it doesn't. Sometimes they operate without a budget, with a, quote, continuing resolution. The People's Budget is much more progressive. It calls for investment in housing and transit, the kind of investment we actually need. And it calls for cutting some of the most egregious aspects of the Pentagon budget. The problem is it developed as a parliamentary device within the Congress. And it doesn't break out right now, though this is something that a group of us at Peace Action are working on. Well, what would, if they voted this, if this budget passed, how much more money would come back to Massachusetts for housing, for what programs? How much more money would come back? So for the communication loop to close, people have to know it. What is the impact going to be on me and my family and my neighborhood? And that's a piece that we have to develop, we have to work on, and I hope in the next year or two we'll have a people's budget for Massachusetts where you could find out, all right, I'm concerned about the higher education, the UMass system, and there are federal funds for higher education. How much more would come to Massachusetts if we pass this budget?
So is there much evidence in your experience, let's say, around peace activism, that these kinds of strategies work? I mean, that the communicating what is otherwise kept out to rechange the agenda and to help what people think about. I mean, what's the evidence of?
Well, I'll give you one.
effectiveness?
So these are going to be small examples, right? Since we're not very
The
successful.
victories are small.
The victories are small. I'm an officer of something called the Cambridge Residents Alliance. We're probably the biggest Cambridge residents organization. And as I mentioned, we're very concerned about transit. And we organize, annual or every once in a while a conference on improving transit in Cambridge and Massachusetts. And a couple of years, I guess it was 4 years ago, we did one. And I tried to get onto the agenda, and I was the chair of the conference. And I tried to get on the agenda the thing about we'd have more money. In order to have enough money, more money for transit, we need to cut the Pentagon budget. I said, couldn't even get it on the agenda.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. Couldn't get it on the agenda. 2 years later, we had the same conference, but things had opened up a little bit. And we were able to get on the agenda a presentation called Subways Not Submarines, where we put up that chart and said, look, nationally only 2% is going for public transportation. One less submarine, one less Ohio-class submarine, and we could build out the Green Line and all the way where people want it. In that context, the audience was very receptive, right? Because they were looking for how are we going to solve this problem. We know this is the richest country on earth. How come there's not enough money to build trains, right? It's bizarre. And then when someone said, oh, this is the reason in the richest country on earth there's not enough money, because all the money is being spent there. People say, oh, okay, right? And the key thing was that we were talking about transit, solving transit problems to people who cared about transit, right? It's not going to work to talk about solving transit problems to people concerned about housing, right? So this message has to be tailored. One of the problems we have in like peace action is we need the capacity to talk specifically to people concerned about housing, to name those programs, specifically about the Veterans Administration hospitals and how much money goes there. And to know about why you should cut the nuclear weapons budget. Well, it's hard for people who are doing this on the side. They're not doing it for a living. They're not professors of the subject to develop sufficient expertise and skill and knowledge of those different constituencies. But I think that's going to be key. It's going to happen on campuses because the cutbacks of campus funding is going to impact, I think, sharply enough that one's going to be able to say to people, you're going to have to deal with this question of the military side of the budget, otherwise you can't solve the problem.
So is it actually, you mentioned, or you used the phrase, things opening up, where, the idea of suddenly you can make a very simple calculation of going from not having a submarine to building a human civilization,
right,
as it were.
Right.
I mean, do you have any idea of what in particular are the forces at work that lead to that kind of opening up? Do you have an idea? I mean, is it something to do with social media, or is it something to do with the level of frustration, the rising poverty, or is it just another set of intersections of different forces suddenly emerging?
Yeah, in some areas, in two areas, I think I have a very good sense. One is higher education, like a place like UMass Boston, where for decades now, people have had this image of access, that they're going to be able to access a higher quality of education than their families could or was expected for them. And then they get there, they discover it's very exciting, there are all these interesting faculty, and then they have to drop out because they can't afford it, right? And there isn't a sufficient financial aid. So there you have and then the families are often intense. So it's the students themselves are being hit hard, and the families are very upset. And there you have a situation where people have a sense that the whole rest of their life is going to be affected by this failure early on. And so in fact, in the end of October, we're having a forum at UMass Boston entitled, or the subtitle is, Invest in Minds, Not Missiles, increase federal funding in education. invest in mines, not missiles. And 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to get that on the agenda. The other area where is affordable housing, where you have this situation. Cambridge is a very good example. People who are homeowners, they're well housed, their kids cannot afford to live in the community. Mm-hmm. This is actually the core of the Cambridge Residents Alliance. This is people who are long-term residents and now find their kids who want to live there can't live there. So they're struggling to understand how come. And so there's also a kind of receptiveness to somebody coming in with an analysis that answers the question. Now, it's not the same as the real estate forces at work, right? That doesn't, cutting an Ohio-class submarine doesn't stop some international real estate operation from buying up property. But in terms of there still is a public sector, there's still public housing, right? There's still Section 8 vouchers. There are still mechanisms, if they're financed properly, to give a little more space. So, those are two examples where things are opening up a little bit. But again, you have these worlds that have been, completely separate for 30 or 40 years. Right? Nobody.
So in that way, I suppose we've got 2 minutes to go, and I was thinking in some ways, what you've got is worlds that have been separate to actually use communication to bring those intersections, to bring those two worlds together, so that somewhere or other media and communication will inform people, will engage in a public exercise. Would that be a relatively simple way of
everybody agrees on that. But I'll tell you what we think. Our experience in trying to do this directly with the media is going directly to the Boston Globe and say, how come you don't cover these things? We have a group of people who rewrite letters every day to the Globe about their failure to cover X, Y, and Z, and they don't get published. So people have gone back to what was done 30 years ago, which is to bring resolutions and bills to local bodies like the Cambridge City Council. We brought a motion to divest the pension fund from companies that manufacture nuclear weapons. That got covered. That got covered, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to have a direct discussion, trying to bring that directly into the media, the importance of that. No, we couldn't do that. But once elected officials had voted on it, so all around Massachusetts and all around the United States, there are local groups planning to put warrants on town meetings, bring resolutions to city council meetings, which basically call, say, the Newton City Council calls on the Congress to stop spending so much money on nuclear weapons and put the money into housing, healthcare, education, and environment. Right. And so that's our current strategy.
It sounds like an interesting and valuable strategy, and something that's been used effectively, if minimally, but with minimal effect, let's say, over the years. But I think it's also instructive for those of us who are interested in communication and media to think about these programs and these projects and the development of social movements, and certainly to perhaps think about what a membership in a group like Peace Action might be worth considering. Definitely. Okay, well that's our time and that's our show. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for your time and for explaining some of these things to us. And that's all from Boston Media Theory and from me, Marcus Breen. Until next time, we'll see you later and keep on mediaing.
Welcome to Understood.org, a free online resource for parents of kids with learning and attention issues, with personalized recommendations, tools, and expert advice.